I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Does he even know this footage exists? Today isn't about a clip that went viral. It's about the silence that followed. Because when 50 Cent helped bring this documentary to Netflix, people expected shock. What they didn't expect was restraint. Moments where the camera lingers, then cuts away. Sentences that stop just before they finish. Names that appear once, then disappear completely. That's not accidental storytelling. That's controlled storytelling. From the very first minutes, this project feels different. Not louder, not messier, quieter. And silence in this industry usually means power is in the room. You can feel it in the pacing. You can hear it in what isn't said. There are scenes that feel edited down too carefully. Stories that sound like summaries instead of explanations. And reactions from people who look like they know more than they're allowed to say. This isn't a documentary trying to expose everything. It's a documentary showing you exactly how much can't be shown. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because when a producer like 50 Cent, someone known for saying exactly what he thinks, chooses implication over confrontation, it raises a bigger question. What requires restraint from someone who usually doesn't have any? Halfway through, you start realizing something else. The real tension isn't in the footage Netflix approved. It's in the gaps between scenes. The pauses, the quick transitions away from certain topics, the way some conversations suddenly end. Before we go deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because this story is moving fast, and the details people are missing right now are the ones that matter most. What you're watching isn't just a story about one man or one moment. It's about how narratives are shaped when multiple interests collide. Legal limits, corporate decisions, reputations that affect more than one career. And when you understand that, the documentary stops feeling incomplete and starts feeling intentional. Because sometimes the most revealing thing isn't what's exposed. It's what everyone agrees not to touch. And that's where this really begins. Once that realization settles in, the documentary starts changing shape in your mind. Because now you're not watching for what's being shown, you're watching for what's being avoided. There's a moment early on where a source begins explaining how certain rooms worked, how invitations weren't random, how presence itself meant something. And just as the explanation starts getting specific, the scene cuts. No follow-up, no clarification, just a transition to the next topic, as if nothing was missing. But something was missing, and that pattern keeps repeating. Every time a conversation edges toward names that still carry power, the camera shifts. Every time timelines start overlapping in uncomfortable ways, the edit tightens. You're left with fragments instead of conclusions. That's not how exposés usually work. That's how negotiations look, because a true tell-all burns bridges. This one walks carefully across them. The people speaking aren't denying anything outright. They're choosing words like environment, culture, unspoken rules. Language designed to say something without triggering consequences. And you can see it on their faces. The hesitation before answering. The glance off camera. The relief when a question changes. What's striking is how much of the story depends on context instead of accusation. Who was in the room? Who stayed quiet afterward? Who benefited from things never being put on record? That's where the weight is. Because when you strip away the headlines, this stops being about scandal and starts being about systems. How influence protects itself. How stories get buried, not by force, but by agreement. The documentary doesn't accuse everyone. It doesn't need to. It shows you the structure and trusts you to connect the dots. And that's more dangerous than naming names. Because once you see the pattern, you start recognizing it everywhere. In old interviews that suddenly feel rehearsed, in friendships that lasted longer than they should have, in silence that stretched on for years without explanation. This isn't a story that ends with one reveal. It's a story that quietly rewrites everything you thought you understood before. And the more you sit with it, the clearer it becomes. What Netflix released isn't the full truth. It's the version of the truth that was allowed to exist. By this point, the documentary isn't trying to shock you anymore. It's trying to train you how to listen. Because once you understand the rules of this world, the quiet moments become louder than any accusation. There's a stretch where former insiders talk about access. Not fame, not money, access. Who got invited back? Who stopped getting calls? Who suddenly disappeared from certain rooms without explanation? Nothing criminal is said out loud. Nothing has to be. You start noticing how careers moved in waves, how someone would rise fast, stall suddenly, then reappear years later under a different banner. How alliances shifted right after certain nights, certain tours, certain private gatherings that were never photographed publicly. The film never says those moments caused anything. It just places them next to each other and lets the silence do the work. And that's where the tension comes from. Because power doesn't usually announce itself with threats. It operates through opportunity, through favors that feel optional until they're not, through doors that open once and never again if you ask the wrong question. Several voices describe the same feeling using different words: pressure without instructions, expectation without contracts, loyalty without explanation. That's when you realize this isn't about one person being exposed. It's about how an entire ecosystem learned to protect itself by never putting anything in writing. Even the editing reflects that. Footage lingers just long enough to make you uncomfortable, then pulls away. Old clips resurface, but only the parts that were once ignored. Smiles that now look rehearsed, jokes that land differently when you know who was listening, and slowly your role as the viewer changes. You're no longer asking, what did they do? You're asking, why did nobody ever push back? Because the most unsettling part isn't the rumors, it's how normalized everything felt at the time. People didn't act scared. They acted careful. And careful behavior doesn't come from nothing. It comes from experience. What the documentary does next is slow everything down. It stops chasing names and starts tracing behavior. You hear about moments where nothing bad technically happened, yet everyone in the room remembers the tension. Conversations that suddenly changed direction. Phones that stopped ringing after a certain night. Invitations that quietly disappeared. No one says they were threatened. They say something worse. They say they understood. Understood when to laugh. Understood when to stay quiet. Understood when asking one more question would cost more than it was worth. And that's when the picture becomes clearer. Because real power doesn't need to scare people. It just needs to make consequences predictable. The documentary lays out how reputation worked like currency. How being good didn't mean being honest. It meant being useful. How staying neutral wasn't safety. It was alignment. You start seeing how silence wasn't random. It was rewarded. People who kept things vague stayed close. People who pushed for clarity drifted away. Not publicly, professionally. And that distinction matters. Because when careers don't end in scandal but in slow erosion, no one calls it punishment. They call it timing, bad luck, industry politics. But when the same pattern repeats across decades, luck stops being a convincing explanation. There's a moment where archive footage is replayed without commentary, no narration, no accusations, just a long pause on a face that knows the camera is there and still chooses not to explain. That pause feels heavier than any allegation because explanation was possible. It just wasn't chosen. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. Every past interview feels different. Every carefully worded answer sounds rehearsed. Every no comment suddenly feels like a strategy, not restraint. The documentary doesn't ask you to believe a theory. It asks you to recognize a pattern. And patterns don't need proof to feel real. They need repetition. By now, you're no longer waiting for a reveal. You're watching behavior. Who stays calm? Who avoids specifics? Who lets time do the talking? Because time in this world has always been the safest place to hide a story that was never meant to be finished. By this point, the story stops feeling like an investigation and starts feeling like a mirror. Because the documentary isn't telling you what to think anymore. It's showing you how things were allowed to feel normal for far too long. There's a shift here that's easy to miss if you're only listening for names or accusations. The focus moves away from what was captured and toward what was never challenged. People describe being in rooms where nothing was said, yet everything was understood, where laughter covered discomfort, where the music stayed loud enough to drown out questions, where nobody needed instructions because the rules were already known. And that's the part that lingers, because rules don't exist unless they're enforced, and enforcement doesn't always look like threats. Sometimes it looks like access. Access to rooms, access to opportunities, access to people who can make things happen or quietly make them stop. The documentary lets you sit with that idea longer than expected. Long enough to realize how many careers were built on proximity, not talent. How many friendships survived because boundaries were never tested? How many people learned that staying close meant staying quiet? What makes this section unsettling is how ordinary it all sounds. No chaos, no shouting, just routines. Routines where certain nights blurred together, where the same faces appeared again and again, where conversations reset the next morning as if nothing needed explaining. And when someone did try to step back, they weren't confronted. They weren't attacked. They were replaced. Replacement is cleaner than conflict. It leaves no record, no villain, just absence. The documentary uses that absence as evidence of something deeper. Not wrongdoing, but design. A system that didn't need force because it had momentum. A structure that didn't need lies because it had time. Time to let memories fade. Time to let people doubt themselves. Time to let uncomfortable moments turn into inside jokes or forgotten stories. You start realizing how silence was never a gap. It was a buffer. A buffer that protected reputations. A buffer that protected relationships. A buffer that kept everything technically intact while emotionally unresolved. That's why this part hits differently. It doesn't accuse anyone of a single act. It questions an entire atmosphere. An atmosphere where clarity was optional, where explanations were postponed indefinitely, where the safest move was to let things pass without naming them. And once you see that atmosphere clearly, it changes how you hear everything that came before. Every pause sounds intentional. Every smile feels measured. Every "we'll talk later" starts to feel permanent. Because later never came. And when later never comes often enough, it stops being coincidence. It becomes culture. That's the realization settling in here. Not that something shocking happened, but that too many things were allowed to never fully end. And stories that never end don't disappear. They wait. By now, something important has shifted in how this story feels. It's no longer about what was shown on screen. It's about what can't be unseen once you recognize the pattern. The documentary slows everything down here on purpose, not to dramatize, but to let the weight of repetition settle in. The same environments, the same social circles, the same faces orbiting power without ever fully explaining why they were there or how long they stayed. When moments repeat often enough, they stop feeling random. They start feeling curated. What stands out is how carefully everything was spaced apart. One moment here, another years later. Nothing close enough to force a conversation. Nothing tight enough to demand accountability. Distance becomes the strategy. Time does the cleaning. And by the time anyone thinks to ask a question, the moment has already aged out of relevance. That's when silence stops looking passive. Silence becomes coordination without communication. People describe being present but not participating, seeing but not reacting, knowing just enough to understand the rules, but never enough to feel responsible for breaking them. And the rules were simple. Don't ask too much, don't stay too long, don't be the first to speak. Because the first person to speak changes the temperature of the room. The documentary doesn't claim everyone understood everything. It suggests something more realistic and more uncomfortable. That most people understood just enough to protect themselves. And self-protection is powerful. It turns curiosity into caution. It turns discomfort into professionalism. It turns memory into something negotiable. What makes this section unsettling is how calm it feels. There's no chaos here, no confrontation, just maintenance. Relationships maintained, access maintained, distance maintained. That kind of order doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when people learn over time what behavior keeps doors open. And when doors stay open long enough, people stop questioning why. That's where the real tension sits now. Not in any single reveal, but in the realization that the system didn't rely on secrecy. It relied on familiarity, familiar faces, familiar settings, familiar excuses, enough normalcy to keep everything moving without interruption. You start to notice how often conversations ended right before clarity, how often explanations were implied instead of stated, how often someone else was expected to ask the hard question and never did. That expectation is the shield, because when everyone assumes someone else is responsible, no one is. This part of the story doesn't accuse anyone of intent. It exposes habit. Habit is harder to defend against because it doesn't require planning. It only requires repetition. And repetition is everywhere here. Same patterns, same pauses, same silences at the same pressure points. Once you see that, the story doesn't feel explosive. It feels engineered to endure. And endurance is far more dangerous than shock, because shock fades. Patterns don't. That's why this moment matters, because the audience stops waiting for proof and starts recognizing structure. And once structure is visible, the story no longer depends on new information. It depends on whether the silence continues. At this stage, the documentary quietly flips the pressure. Instead of asking the audience to judge what happened, it asks them to notice what never happened. There were moments when explanations could have closed the story, moments when clarity would have ended speculation, moments when a simple answer would have been enough. But those moments passed, not with resistance, with avoidance. And avoidance is revealing, because avoiding a question isn't the same as not having an answer. It's choosing not to give one. The film revisits interviews that once felt harmless. At the time, they sounded smooth, confident, controlled. Now, placed back to back, something feels off, not wrong, incomplete. Answers that circle but never land. Sentences that stop just short of meaning anything concrete. That restraint used to look like professionalism, now it looks like strategy. You start to see how power behaves when it knows it doesn't have to explain itself, how it relies on reputation to do the talking, how it trusts time to soften edges and turn discomfort into nostalgia. What's unsettling is how effective that trust was. People moved on, headlines changed, careers continued, and because nothing blew up, silence was rewarded. The documentary lets this realization sit. No music cue, no dramatic turn, just a quiet accumulation of moments where something could have been addressed and wasn't. That's when the story stops being about individuals and starts being about insulation. Insulation from consequence, insulation from scrutiny, insulation built by layers of familiarity, loyalty, and unspoken rules. You hear how being close to power meant learning when to disappear, when to stay off camera, when to let someone else take the spotlight, when to accept that certain conversations were off limits without ever being declared that way. Those boundaries weren't written down. They were felt. And felt boundaries are the hardest to challenge, because challenging them makes you look unreasonable, like you're breaking etiquette instead of asking a fair question. That's the trap. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of enforcing silence. It shows how silence enforced itself. Because once enough people benefit from not asking, the system sustains itself. No threats required, no orders given, just a shared understanding of how things work. And that understanding becomes generational. New people enter the room and sense it immediately. They don't need to be told. They watch. They adjust. By now, the viewer realizes something important. The story didn't survive because it was hidden. It survived because it was normalized. Normalized silence, normalized deflection, normalized moving on without closure. That's what makes this section heavy. Not the idea that something dramatic was concealed, but that too many people learned how to live comfortably inside unanswered questions. And once unanswered questions become comfortable, they stop demanding resolution until someone lines them up, until someone refuses to let time separate them, until patterns replace excuses. That's where this is heading, and you can feel it, because the silence that once protected everything is starting to feel loud. This is where everything shifts, not because something new is revealed, but because something old finally connects. Up to this point, the documentary has been teaching you how to watch, how to listen for gaps instead of statements, how to notice what keeps repeating without ever being acknowledged. And now it places those moments side by side instead of letting time separate them. That's the turning point. Because when distance disappears, excuses lose their power. Suddenly, interviews from different decades feel like the same conversation. Pauses line up. Deflections mirror each other. The same comfort with ambiguity shows up again and again, no matter the era. And you realize this was never about waiting for the right moment to explain. There was never an intention to explain at all. Silence wasn't temporary, it was structural. The documentary doesn't raise its voice here. It doesn't escalate emotionally. It does something far more unsettling. It removes the benefit of maybe. Maybe it was misunderstood. Maybe it was exaggerated. Maybe it was just timing. Those maybes stop working once patterns become visible. Because patterns don't need accusations. They explain themselves. You see how questions were managed instead of answered. How narratives were redirected instead of resolved. How attention was allowed to drift until nothing felt urgent anymore. And the most uncomfortable realization lands quietly. This system didn't survive because nobody noticed. It survived because noticing didn't seem to change anything. People learned that speaking up didn't bring clarity, it brought distance. That asking questions didn't lead to answers, it led to isolation. So silence became practical, not moral, not noble, practical. And practical choices, repeated over time, build cultures. This is the moment where the documentary stops being about exposure and starts being about accountability without accusation. It doesn't say who is guilty. It asks who benefited from never needing to explain. Because explanation creates records. Records create memory. Memory creates responsibility. Silence avoids all three. That's why this moment feels heavy, not dramatic, not explosive, inevitable. The audience is no longer waiting for proof. They're watching how power responds when its patterns are recognized. Because once recognition happens, silence doesn't reset the conversation anymore. It freezes it. Every pause now adds weight. Every non-answer becomes data. Every attempt to move on feels unfinished. And that's the point of no return. From here on, the story doesn't need new material to keep unfolding. It only needs the silence to continue behaving the way it always has. Because now everyone can see what it's doing. And once silence is seen as a choice instead of an absence, it stops protecting anything. It becomes the loudest part of the story. By now, the tension isn't coming from what's being shown. It's coming from what happens next. Because once a pattern is recognized, the story stops belonging to the filmmaker and starts belonging to the audience. People don't need to be told what to think anymore. They're watching behavior, timing, reactions. Who stays visible? Who suddenly disappears? This is the phase where silence changes meaning. Earlier, silence felt like confidence. Now it feels like calculation. Every appearance is examined for what's missing. Every statement is weighed against what it avoids. Every pause becomes part of the record. And the industry feels it, not loudly, but deeply. You can see it in the way conversations shift, the way names are referenced carefully, the way stories are framed without finishing sentences, the way people speak around things instead of through them. That's not coincidence. That's adaptation. Because when attention becomes patient, power has to adjust. It can't rely on time to erase memory anymore. Clips don't disappear. Interviews don't fade. Context doesn't reset. Everything exists at once. And when everything exists at once, coherence matters. This is where pressure shows up without outrage. Not mobs, not viral rage, just expectation. The quiet expectation that if something has followed the same shape for years, maybe it deserves a complete explanation. That expectation doesn't demand a response. It waits for one. And waiting is uncomfortable for systems built on momentum, on moving forward, on letting the next headline replace the last unresolved one. But the audience didn't move on this time. They slowed down. They noticed how often clarity was promised later, how often later never came, how frequently silence appeared at the exact moment resolution would have closed the story. That repetition doesn't scream wrongdoing. It whispers strategy. And once people hear that whisper, they can't unhear it. This is why reactions matter more than revelations now. Because reactions reveal priorities. What's addressed quickly, what's avoided entirely, what's treated as worth explanation, and what's treated as beneath it. Those choices create a hierarchy, and hierarchies tell stories. The documentary doesn't need to push further. It lets the environment respond. It watches how comfort shifts into caution, how confidence tightens into restraint, how silence grows heavier the longer it lasts. Because silence used to be neutral space. Now it's evidence of a decision, not evidence of guilt, evidence of control. And control, once noticed, changes the relationship between power and audience forever. From here, the story doesn't escalate. It stabilizes. It becomes something that lives in memory, not headlines. Something that resurfaces every time a new appearance happens. Every time an old clip is replayed. Every time someone chooses not to answer. And that's the kind of story that doesn't burn out. It waits. By the time a story reaches this point, something important has already shifted. It's no longer about exposure. It's about awareness. Nothing dramatic needs to happen next for the impact to continue. No new footage. No fresh statements. No explosive claims. The framework has already changed. And once that happens, control quietly slips away. Because now the audience isn't waiting to be convinced. They're watching how silence is used.
I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Today changes everything. Not because of a rumor, not because of a tweet, but because a brand new Netflix documentary has arrived that claims to show material the public has never seen before. And once you understand what's being presented, it becomes very clear why this moment feels different. For years, people believed the story around power in the music industry had already been told. They thought everything important had surfaced, that whatever happened behind the scenes had already been discussed, debated, and buried by time. But this documentary doesn't come in loud. It doesn't open with accusations. It opens with context. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because context doesn't scream. Context connects. What's being shown here isn't framed as a sudden reveal. It's framed as a missing layer. The documentary claims there were clips, recordings, images, and moments that existed long before headlines ever caught up. Material that didn't fit neatly into the public version of events. And instead of saying this proves something, the film does something more unsettling. It asks why these things were never placed side by side until now. That's the key difference. Individually, moments can be dismissed. Together, patterns start to form. The documentary positions itself as a continuation, not a correction. It suggests that what audiences saw before may have only scratched the surface, not because the rest didn't exist, but because timing matters when power's involved. When stories surface too early, they disappear. When they surface too late, they feel irrelevant. But when they surface at the exact right moment, they force attention. And this moment is carefully chosen. What's especially striking is how the film avoids direct statements. Instead, it lays out sequences: who was present, what environments existed, how certain relationships overlapped, and how often silence followed moments that might have deserved explanation. The documentary doesn't accuse, it observes. An observation, when done patiently, can be far more unsettling than any allegation. Halfway through watching, something becomes clear. This isn't about shocking viewers with content. It's about reframing memory, about asking the audience to revisit things they already know, but without the gaps, without the years in between, without the comfort of forgetting. Before we go deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story is moving fast, and what comes next builds directly on what you're hearing right now. What makes this release hit harder is who it involves and how cautiously the information is presented. The documentary repeatedly reminds viewers that influence doesn't need to announce itself. It operates quietly. through access, through proximity, through environments where nothing is technically said, but everything is understood. And when footage, audio, or images are shown within that framework, they don't need to be explosive to feel heavy. They simply need to exist. The most uncomfortable part isn't what's shown, it's what isn't explained. Why certain moments were allowed to pass without clarity. Why questions stopped being asked. Why silence consistently followed the same pressure points. The film doesn't rush to answer those questions. It lets them hang. And by doing that, it pulls the audience into a different role. Not spectators, not jurors. Observers of a system that relied on time doing the work instead of truth. This is why people are reacting so strongly. Not because the documentary claims to expose secrets, but because it challenges the idea that nothing was hidden at all. It suggests that things weren't buried. They were simply never connected. And once you start connecting them, the story doesn't feel explosive, it feels intentional. That's where this begins. Once you settle into what the documentary is actually doing, the tension shifts. It's no longer about shock, it becomes about realization. Because the film doesn't rush forward. It moves backward, retracing moments people thought were already understood, then placing them back into context that was never available at the time. What stands out immediately is how deliberate the pacing feels. Nothing is dropped randomly. Every clip, every image, every recorded moment is introduced with restraint, almost as if the documentary is testing how much the audience remembers, and how much they were never encouraged to question. The film doesn't say, "Here is the truth." It asks, why did this never become part of the conversation? That question changes everything. When familiar names appear, they're not framed as villains or heroes. They're framed as constants, always present, always nearby, always part of the same environments. And that consistency is where the discomfort begins to build. Because coincidence can explain one overlap. It struggles to explain a pattern. The documentary repeatedly returns to the same idea. Power doesn't need secrecy to survive. It needs normalization. It needs moments to feel ordinary when they happen, so no one thinks to look back later. That's why the film emphasizes timing. When footage was captured, when recordings were made, when images existed versus when the public ever heard about them. There's a subtle but powerful suggestion being made that some material wasn't hidden because it was illegal or explosive, but because it would have raised questions too early. Questions that would have disrupted careers, alliances, and narratives that were still being built. And the film makes it clear, this isn't about one night, one clip, or one person. It's about environments, spaces where influence operated quietly, rooms where people felt protected by proximity to power, situations where silence wasn't fear, it was confidence. What's unsettling is how calm the documentary remains while presenting this. There's no dramatic music cue telling you how to feel, no voice pushing a conclusion. Instead, the audience is trusted to notice what keeps repeating, the same faces, the same circles, the same absence of explanation when moments pass that seem, in hindsight, unfinished. At a certain point, you stop waiting for a reveal. You start watching behavior, how people speak, how they don't, how narratives are framed just wide enough to feel complete, but never wide enough to include everything. That's when the weight sets in, because the documentary isn't asking viewers to believe something new. It's asking them to reconsider something old, to look at history not as a series of isolated events, but as a carefully managed flow of attention. Where stories weren't erased, they were spaced out until they lost urgency. And urgency is dangerous to power. The longer you watch, the clearer it becomes that this release isn't meant to close a chapter. It's meant to reopen memory, to collapse distance, to make moments that once felt harmless sit next to each other without years in between to soften them. Nothing explodes here. It tightens. And when a story tightens instead of exploding, it doesn't go away when the screen goes dark. It follows you. It lingers. It makes you rethink what silence actually meant and who benefited from it most. As the documentary continues unfolding, something subtle but important happens. The focus shifts away from what is shown and toward what was never explained. That's where the tension really starts to build. Because the more you watch, the more you realize this isn't about shocking footage. It's about patterns that were allowed to exist without interruption. The film keeps circling back to the same environments, the same kinds of gatherings, the same social spaces where influence moved quietly, without headlines or accountability. These weren't secret locations hidden from the world. They were open rooms filled with powerful people, where nothing felt urgent enough to question in real time. And that's exactly why those moments survived untouched for so long. What makes this uncomfortable isn't accusation, it's familiarity. Viewers recognize the faces, the names, the era. These weren't outsiders slipping through cracks. These were central figures moving confidently through systems that never required them to explain themselves. The documentary doesn't rush to connect dots. It lets the audience do that naturally, by showing how often the same energy appears across different years and different situations. There's a moment where you realize the silence wasn't passive, it was active. Silence functioned like insulation. It kept questions from gaining momentum. It allowed narratives to continue uninterrupted. And once you see that, the past doesn't feel distant anymore. It feels structured. The documentary uses restraint as its strongest weapon. And instead of telling you what to think, it shows you how often opportunities for clarity appeared and quietly passed. Interviews where answers stopped just short. Stories that ended without conclusions. Moments that should have been revisited but never were. Not because they were resolved, but because time was trusted to smooth them out. And time usually does that, until people stop forgetting. This is where the viewing experience changes. You stop consuming. You start observing. You notice how calm everything feels, even when it shouldn't. How confident silence sounds when it's backed by reputation. How distance replaces explanation so effectively that no one even notices what's missing. The documentary never claims this proves anything criminal. That's not its goal. Its goal is far more unsettling. It exposes comfort. The comfort of knowing you don't have to explain everything. The comfort of believing attention will move on. The comfort of silence doing the work instead of truth. As the layers build, it becomes clear this story isn't driven by new revelations. It's driven by old ones finally being placed side by side. And when that happens, coincidence starts to feel strained. Patterns begin to speak for themselves. What lingers most is the realization that nothing here had to be hidden to be protected. It only had to be left unfinished, and unfinished stories don't disappear. They wait. By the end of this section, the audience isn't asking what happened anymore. They're asking something far more dangerous to powerful systems. Why was nothing ever fully explained? And once that question takes root, it doesn't fade, it deepens. As this section unfolds, the documentary leans into something even more uncomfortable: memory. Not dramatic revelations, not explosive accusations, but the act of remembering things people were never encouraged to hold on to for long. Moments that felt minor when they happened. Interactions that passed without follow-up. Images that circulated briefly and then vanished from conversation. The film quietly challenges the idea that nothing happened simply because nothing was said. It reminds the audience how easily unfinished moments are dismissed when they're surrounded by fame, success, and momentum. When careers are rising, questions feel inconvenient. When influence is strong, silence feels like confidence. What becomes increasingly clear is that visibility and accountability don't always travel together. Some people are seen constantly, yet rarely examined. Their presence is normalized, their access unquestioned, their environments treated as untouchable simply because they've existed for so long without interruption. The documentary doesn't frame this as a conspiracy. It frames it as habit, a system that learned early on how to protect itself by never forcing closure. Conversations drifted, stories softened, attention moved on. And every time it did, the structure grew stronger. You begin to notice how often context is missing. Not erased, just absent. Clips are shown without commentary, letting viewers feel the discomfort of realizing they've seen fragments of this story before, just never assembled this way. The power isn't in what's revealed, it's in what's resequenced. The audience starts connecting eras that were previously kept apart. Early success, peak influence, later controversies. When those phases are no longer separated by time, the narrative feels different, Heavier, not louder, heavier. Because weight comes from accumulation, not shock. There's also a noticeable shift in how authority is presented. No one rushes to defend. No one rushes to explain. That restraint once read as dignity. Now it reads as strategy, a quiet confidence that time would continue doing its job. But time behaves differently when people stop forgetting. This is where the documentary becomes unsettling. Not because it tells you what to think, but because it removes the comfort of dismissal. You can't brush these moments off as isolated anymore. They sit next to each other. They echo. They repeat. And repetition is never accidental. The film keeps returning to the same idea. Silence wasn't the absence of response. It was the response. A response chosen because it worked, because it didn't provoke, because it didn't demand resolution, because it let narratives continue uninterrupted. By now, the audience isn't waiting for a smoking gun. They're recognizing a structure, a way power learned to manage attention without confrontation. And once that structure becomes visible, it doesn't collapse. It tightens. The tension grows not from what's being said, but from what still isn't. From realizing how many chances there were to clarify, to address, to explain, and how consistently those chances were bypassed. This part doesn't escalate the story. It stabilizes it. And that stability is far more unsettling than chaos, because it suggests this wasn't disorder. It was design. At this stage, the documentary stops feeling like a story being told to you and starts feeling like something you're slowly realizing on your own. The pace remains calm, almost patient, but the implications grow heavier with every sequence. Not because something shocking is introduced, but because nothing is corrected. What stands out now is how often power relied on familiarity. The same circles, the same social gravity, pulling the same people into the same rooms, decade after decade. When something repeats long enough, it stops being questioned. It becomes part of the background. And background is where accountability goes to disappear. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone directly. Instead, it keeps doing something far more effective. It shows continuity. Moments that were once treated as isolated now sit next to each other without explanation. And once that happens, coincidence starts to feel uncomfortable. You notice how often situations were framed as misunderstandings rather than moments needing clarity. How narratives were allowed to fade rather than be finished. How silence was never broken because it never needed to be. The structure was already working. This is where the idea of normal begins to collapse. Normal isn't defined by what's right, it's defined by what's repeated without consequence. And the film quietly asks the viewer to consider how many things were accepted simply because they'd been accepted before. There's also a growing awareness of how protection operates, not through threats or force, but through reputation. When a name becomes big enough, it shields itself. People hesitate, questions soften, curiosity gets delayed, and delay over time becomes erasure. What's unsettling is how disciplined the silence feels. No emotional outbursts, no defensive reactions, just distance. Distance from context, distance from explanation, distance from responsibility. And distance works until people start measuring it. This is where the audience's role changes. You're no longer watching to see what happens next. You're watching to see what doesn't, who engages, who avoids, who addresses context and who never does. That absence becomes part of the narrative. The documentary doesn't demand outrage. It cultivates attention. The kind of attention that doesn't burn out. The kind that tracks patterns across time. And once attention becomes steady instead of reactive, silence loses its advantage. By now it's clear this isn't about uncovering something hidden. It's about understanding why so much was allowed to remain unresolved. Why stories were never closed. Why clarity was always postponed. And postponed long enough, questions don't disappear. They stack. This part of the documentary doesn't add new weight. It reveals how much weight was already there, quietly waiting for someone to stop looking away. By this point, the story shifts in a subtle but important way. It's no longer centered on what was shown. It's centered on why certain things were never challenged when they first appeared. The documentary slows down here, almost deliberately, as if giving the viewer space to think instead of react. What becomes clear is how influence doesn't just protect actions, it shapes perception. When someone controls rooms, timing, and access, the narrative doesn't need to be rewritten. It just needs to be delayed. Questions don't get answered. They get pushed forward. And pushed forward long enough, they stop feeling urgent. You start noticing how moments that once felt random begin to line up. Not because the film tells you they do, but because time finally allows them to sit next to each other. Old interviews, old footage, old reactions that suddenly feel different when viewed without the pressure of hype or loyalty. This is where the idea of credibility quietly enters the room. Not credibility as in truth versus lies, but credibility as in who was allowed to speak freely and who was never asked to explain anything at all. Silence becomes a privilege, and privileges are rarely accidental. There's also an unspoken theme here about how power doesn't always need defense. Sometimes it survives simply by being familiar. When people grow used to seeing the same faces in the same spaces, accountability starts to feel disruptive instead of necessary. That's when systems protect themselves automatically. The documentary doesn't accuse, it observes. And that observation becomes uncomfortable because it removes excuses. There's no chaos, no emotional music pushing you toward a conclusion, just structure, repetition, patterns that don't explain themselves, but don't need to. At this stage, the viewer realizes something important. The real tension isn't about what might be revealed later. It's about how much was already visible before anyone decided to look closely. The pieces weren't hidden, they were scattered, and scattered things don't draw attention until someone gathers them. This is also where responsibility subtly shifts outward. Not to blame the audience, but to involve them. Once you've seen patterns, you can't unsee them. And once you notice silence, you start recognizing where it's still happening. The film understands that outrage fades quickly, so instead, it builds awareness slowly. Awareness lasts longer. It changes how future moments are interpreted. It forces context where there once was none. By the end of this section, you're no longer asking, what's going to be exposed next? You're asking something far more unsettling. How much has already been seen and simply accepted because no one stopped to connect it? By now, the pressure isn't coming from new information. It's coming from perspective. The way earlier moments feel heavier once you understand how carefully everything was framed. This is where the story stops being about shock and starts being about weight. You realize how timing was used like a shield. Certain clips aired when attention was elsewhere. Certain voices spoke only after moments had passed. Not because the truth wasn't there, but because momentum protects more effectively than denial ever could. What's unsettling is how normalized it all felt at the time. The industry didn't freeze. It didn't push back. It kept moving. Awards were still handed out. Appearances were still made. Smiles still showed up on camera. And that normalcy did more damage than any headline ever could. This section forces you to confront how power operates quietly. No threats, no warnings, just access, invitations, silence. When everyone benefits from keeping things smooth, rough edges get ignored. And ignored long enough, they disappear from conversation entirely. You start noticing the absence of reactions, moments where responses should have followed, but didn't. Situations where clarification was expected, but never asked for. Not because people didn't notice, but because noticing out loud comes with consequences. The documentary doesn't rush here. It lets discomfort sit, because discomfort is the point. If it moved faster, you might miss how intentional the pacing really is. Slow enough to think. Slow enough to remember how often similar patterns showed up before. And that's when the audience becomes part of the equation. Not as spectators, but as witnesses. Once you see how influence softens scrutiny, it becomes impossible to ignore how often that same process repeats across different stories, different names, different eras. This isn't about proving something new, it's about recognizing something old. The way power reshapes reality by controlling what feels familiar, acceptable, and untouchable. The way silence becomes routine instead of suspicious. By the end of this stretch, the tension isn't loud, it's internal. You're no longer waiting for a reveal. You're sitting with the realization that the most effective cover was never secrecy. It was comfort. And once comfort sets in, the hardest thing to break isn't a story. It's the habit of looking away. This is where everything shifts. Not because of a new clip, not because of a leaked recording, but because the story finally stops pretending these moments were isolated. Up to now, it's been easy for people to say, that was years ago, or that was taken out of context, or everyone already knew that. Those phrases worked because nothing forced them to sit next to each other. Time kept the distance. Memory stayed fragmented. But here, that distance collapses. You start seeing how the same names keep appearing at the edges of different moments. How the same rooms, the same energy, the same silence repeats itself. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, consistently. And consistency is where coincidence runs out of excuses. This is the point where the documentary stops asking you to react and starts asking you to recognize. Recognize how often explanations were promised later and how rarely later ever came. Recognize how narratives were redirected instead of resolved. Recognize how power didn't need to erase anything. It only needed to let time stretch long enough for people to stop asking. What makes this the turning point is that the silence finally gets framed as a decision, not an absence. When moments are replayed back to back, you feel it. The pauses, the careful wording, the way answers end just before they become uncomfortable. And suddenly, it's not about what's shown, it's about what was always missing. You realize that the real protection wasn't secrecy, it was familiarity. The comfort of seeing the same faces, hearing the same tone, trusting that nothing serious would ever be addressed directly. That comfort trained the audience to accept gaps as normal. But once those gaps are lined up, they stop feeling harmless. They feel intentional. This is where the pressure changes shape. It's no longer fueled by outrage. It's fueled by awareness. Awareness that silence kept working because no one treated it as evidence of anything. Awareness that time was used as insulation. Awareness that power doesn't rush when it knows attention will eventually move on. Except this time, it didn't. The audience stayed. And staying changes everything. Because when people stop chasing shock and start tracking patterns, the story can't reset anymore. It doesn't matter what comes next. The lens has changed. Every new appearance, every quiet response, every non-response now lands differently. That's the moment this documentary creates. Not exposure, not accusation, recognition. Once recognition happens, there's no going back to watching passively. You don't need someone to tell you what to think. You feel the weight for yourself, and weight doesn't fade quickly. This is where the narrative locks in. Because from here on out, silence isn't neutral. It's loud. By this point, the question isn't what will be revealed next. It's who can still pretend they didn't understand what they were watching. Because once the pattern is clear, every previous moment gets re-examined. Old interviews don't sound the same. Old jokes don't land the same. Old denials feel thinner. What once passed as confidence now reads like calculation. What once felt casual now feels rehearsed. This is where the pressure stops being external and becomes internal. Viewers start replaying moments in their own heads. Things they brushed off, things they laughed at, things they told themselves were just industry stuff. And the uncomfortable truth settles in. The system didn't survive because nobody knew. It survived because knowing didn't feel urgent. Until now. What makes this section hit harder isn't volume, it's restraint. The documentary doesn't shout. It lets the silence stretch. It lets familiar faces speak in ways that suddenly feel incomplete. And in those gaps, the audience fills in what they already sensed but never connected. That's the shift. This isn't about exposing a secret anymore. It's about exposing a habit of deflection, a habit of waiting things out, a habit of trusting that attention will always move on before accountability arrives. But attention didn't move on. And once attention stays, power loses its favorite shield, time. You can feel it in how the story slows down here. Not because it's running out of material, but because it wants you to sit with what's already been shown. To realize that nothing new is required for the picture to make sense. Everything necessary has already been there, scattered across years of public moments. This is the realization point. The moment viewers understand that the most effective form of control isn't force, It's normalization. When behavior becomes familiar, it stops being questioned. When silence becomes routine, it stops feeling suspicious. When narratives repeat long enough, they feel permanent until someone rearranges them. That rearrangement is what breaks the spell. From here on, every response will be measured against this new awareness. Every appearance will be scanned for what's avoided. Every statement will be weighed not by what it says, but by what it refuses to address. And that's the real turning point. Because once the audience starts listening for what's missing, the story never sounds the same again. By the end of this, what lingers isn't shock, it's clarity. Because when everything slows down, when the noise fades, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This story didn't explode overnight. It unfolded quietly over years in plain sight. The only difference now is that the silence around it finally broke. What you're left with isn't a single villain or a single moment. It's a system that relied on distraction, on fame being louder than questions, on success being used as a shield, and on the assumption that time would bury everything before anyone connected the dots. That assumption failed, and once it failed, the balance shifted. Now every move is watched differently. Every absence speaks. Every statement is analyzed not for confidence, but for avoidance. The industry that once closed ranks feels less solid. The distance between power and accountability doesn't feel as wide as it used to. This isn't about celebrating anyone's downfall. It's about understanding how long certain stories were allowed to exist without challenge. And why? Because when attention finally stays focused, it changes behavior. It forces explanations. It exposes patterns that can't be dismissed as coincidence anymore. And it reminds everyone watching that influence without oversight always leaves a trail. What happens next won't be decided by one documentary, one clip, or one voice. It will be decided by whether people keep asking questions when it's no longer trending, whether they remember what they saw once the headlines shift, whether silence is allowed to return, or whether awareness becomes permanent. That's the real test. Because history shows that exposure only matters if memory lasts. And now that the story is out in the open, the only thing more powerful than what's been revealed is what the audience chooses to do with it. Stay watching, stay aware, and don't let this be the moment that fades quietly into the background.